Section number 91, the blind man healed, and he testifies of Christ. And this actually is a little bit of a harder lesson to do. It's got like some sections in here that really I think gives some challenge to our thinking. So let's go through this and let's see how we do with it. Okay, so Jesus is passing by and he spots this blind man. Something that you want to make sure to note is that he's in Jerusalem doing this, and as he's doing so, the apostles are there. They are not familiar with this area, and I had a question about this put to me from a friend, and that inside this issue here, and it'll come out to be important, a little bit important for us to know that. So we're on question 545. Okay, how did Jesus show that he was the light of the world? How did Jesus show that he was light of the world? This is based on verses 1 to 5, which we'll use for the next question also. It says, and as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And so the answer that we got is B, he healed a man who was blind from birth. Now, is there anything in that might have jumped out at you a little bit in this situation? I really doubt it. It was something I had not considered myself before in the past. Anything in here is related to him being blind from birth? Go ahead, give it a shot.
God allowed people to be blind because of providence and that he was going to go at this moment.
Oh, that's going to be coming up, but that's not the thing that should jump out of this right away. It looks like it could present a little bit of a problem. I'll give one more shot, brother. We should use the microphones, by the way. Doesn't matter since it's not the one I was looking at, but when it comes to that, we will. Go ahead, Brother Tone.
Yeah, this is a deviation from previous healing of blind men by Jesus. This one is a targeted healing. The blind man didn't ask him for healing. Neither did he know anything about healing. He was just begging there.
Yeah.
But yet Jesus saw fit to go to him.
Yeah, but it's not the only time this happens. But that is a significant thing. We had somebody one time who suggested to us and wondered if. Or had suggested that that people, in order to get healing, always had to request it from Christ in faith, that it all depended on their faith. Nancy, was that about it?
Well, what was said was they had to ask to be healed.
They had to ask to be healed, and then their healing would be dependent on their faith. But no, here, as Brother Tone said, is not approaching anybody.
And this is important to note, Pastor, because he is going to come up with a lesson on spiritual blindness, and he is trying to teach the disciples to something about it. Yet the disciples were not paying attention, and they, instead of showing some compassion for his affliction, they were more interested in the abstract, the philosophical. They're like philosophers rather than engaging in theology. Who sinned for? What caused this? Is it the sin of the father or he himself?
Okay. Now, these are all significant things. It's not the thing that's alarming here. I'll give one. I was going to make it the last one. I'll give you one shot there.
I'm not sure if this is what you're shooting for. Is it a theological point that you're looking for, more or less? Because the only thing I could
point. It's something that
the only thing I could think of that I mean, just off the top of my head, is that Jesus says that neither of them have sinned, and people might take that a little further than it's meant to go.
Okay, we're going to get there. These are all, again, significant things. Here's the thing. He's blind from birth. John identifies he's blind from birth, and the disciples ask him, the apostles ask him, who did sin, this man or his parents? Okay, well, how could the man sin from the time he was born? Okay, because we understand that that there's a time period, we pretty much teach there's a time period where somebody's not held accountable for their sin. And so there's actually a teaching out there. Let me see if I can remember how this goes. That there's a suggestion that the Jews held to some form of reincarnation. And I was shocked to hear that somebody would say that. So I looked at it, and we looked at the passage, 9 Ways of Sunday. Here's how you deal with this. Okay, they're in Jerusalem. The apostles were pretty much from up in Galilee. All the ministry had been up in Galilee. I mean, if there was a chance for them to know, like you know everybody in your neighborhood, those regions were actually kind of small, and so you'd be more likely to know maybe somebody up in the Galilee region. Not necessarily, just more likely. Definitely you wouldn't be familiar with the people hanging out down in Jerusalem. So when they're asking this question, it's not because they're suggesting that the man was able to sin or was reincarnated and now he's getting judged for the sin in his reincarnation. So it's not even a real possibility of something like that. They don't know who this guy is, and they're now asking this question. So that's just the thing. If ever you come across this, I had never come across it. Somebody brought it up to me a few months ago, a friend of mine, and I was a little surprised by it myself. Okay. So that's the odd thing. Now, everything else that you're saying is going to be coming out, but that's the odd thing in this, I think. Let's look at C. How did Jesus? I'm sorry. I'm on. No, that's right. Yeah, I did several sections here. Okay. How did Jesus know that show that he was the light of the world? Well, C. He made the Pharisees born again so they could believe on him. Okay. What is this a reference to? Calvinism. Okay. C is a teaching of Calvinism that does not recognize believing as a capacity of man. Okay, Calvinists do not think that having faith is something that he has an ability to do when he is lost, while he is lost. That it's only after God gives him the ability to believe that he can then exercise faith. Okay, so so for showing that he was light of the world, it's not that he made them able to believe. They had that as a capacity. So different abilities of man would include things such as reasoning, having a will, the ability to recognize good and evil. Man can recognize good and evil. They can see what good is. That's what came from eating of the tree of the knowledge of what? The knowledge of good and evil. So they can recognize good. See, the Calvinists would say man cannot conceive of such things. He doesn't have the ability to understand these things. Man has the ability to feel, to have emotions. Okay? All of those abilities are at play whether somebody applies that to a God of their own design or whether they apply it to God. And so it's not that God gave the people the ability all of a sudden to understand, and that's how he's the light of the world. He showed that he's the light of the world by healing the man who was blind from birth. Now, if you look at A, he started a school of philosophy for enlightenment. Is that how Jesus would show that he's the light of the world? Because of the Enlightenment? Okay, this is a reference to a whole period of history. The Enlightenment in history refers to the time period from the early 1660s, the early 1600s, through the 1700s. Okay, now the Enlightenment, it sounds good, like he wants to give people light, to enlighten them, to make them enlightened. Sounds like a good idea. Wouldn't it be good that man goes through a time of the Dark Ages and then he becomes enlightened? Except that the Enlightenment emphasized the sovereignty of human reason and the evidence of the senses as the primary sources of knowledge. It was a departure from earlier periods which emphasized theological issues and interests. When you look at periods of history, that's something that's kind of interesting to do. Does anybody know what period we are in right now? Okay, postmodern period, okay? In fact, there might be one after that, postmodern. Okay, that was the latest thing we went through. You know what happened? You know what came before the postmodern period? The modern period, okay? And there's a difference between them. Okay, so the Enlightenment, before that you had the period of the church fathers, the patristic age. That was where you had the preachers that just came out from Jerusalem and the early churches. And what they did was they just preached the truth of God's word. So you see, there was the emphasis on biblical doctrine that had been passed on to the faithful. Then came a period known as the scholastic age. Scholasticism, okay, comes from the idea of having a school. And they were called the schoolmen. And this age was characterized by their methods that were used to reconcile Christianity and faith with philosophy. They tried to bring in philosophy and say, well, there are other teachings. Now, once you do that, what happens is people start making these assumptions. Now, this is something you say, I think I've heard him say that before. I say it as often as I can, okay? Philosophy makes assumptions. Now, how good the assumptions are depends on how well-grounded they are. So making assumptions is not bad, it's just that you got to make sure you have them well-grounded. Okay, so they tried to work philosophy in there. Then came a period called Renaissance humanism. Now, humanism has a bad connotation today because it makes man the center of things and man's reason, and it sort of gets rid of God. But Renaissance humanism did not try to get rid of God. Okay, in all these three periods, they still were trying to get some sense of God mixed in with their thinking. Renaissance humanism emphasized the humanities. What are the humanities? Brother Joe, you would be able to guess some humanities right off the bat, I'm sure. So I don't mind calling on you. Literature, history, poetry, yes, art. Okay, as opposed to math and science. And so, but in that time period, what had happened was the scholastics had gotten so far off course that men of God, well, I should say churchmen, I don't know if they were all men of God, but anyhow, they emphasized getting back to the original documents. It was because of that you had an interest in getting back to Greek and the firming up of the Textus Receptus, where we get our King James Version from. And so because of that emphasis, they went back to that, the emphasis on the arts. So you had God mixed up in all of these things, but the Enlightenment tried to get rid of God. Let me go to Joe here, and before I go on further.
Yeah, I just had a question about the scholastic movement that you mentioned, because you're saying it kind of integrated the Bible and philosophy. Would that have been a revival of the older, quote-unquote, church fathers like Philo and Origen? Because it certainly would have, they certainly did the same thing.
They were trying to do that. It wasn't characteristic of that age. The scholastic age would start about the time of Augustine.
No, I understand that, but I mean, would that be considered a revival of that type of thinking? Was that a modern-day take on that type of thinking? Because I know that...
Not so much a revival, but it was that kind of thinking put on steroids. It gained steam under Augustine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, because they were integrating Plato and Aristotle into all of their understanding of the Bible, right?
Yeah, they did, but the age was more characterized by just straight, here's what we received from the apostles.
Okay.
That was the characteristic of the age. Okay, so the Enlightenment, it turned out, instead of giving light, it turned out to be darkness. It produced intolerance of Christianity and religion in general. It sought to produce values that was based on a consensus that was acceptable to both believer and unbeliever. In other words, since Christianity believes in exclusivity, that was one of the problems of the early church. The early church, they were called atheists. The Christians were called atheists, okay, because they didn't believe in the gods of Rome. And they would not tolerate the gods of Rome. Rome was happy to have the Christians around, except they had a law that you had to not put down any other god. And so you would have these Christians come along and say, no, there's only one God, it's Jesus Christ, God the Father. And so they said, oh, you're against the gods, you are atheists. You're atheists. So Christianity believes in exclusivity with no room for error alongside of the truth. But they had a society in the Enlightenment that tried to develop a universal standard that was inclusive, which had to get rid of anything that was exclusive. In other words, it's like the same problem you have today, where the only way to achieve unity is to get rid of those who disagree with you. Okay? Jesus did not seek to bring about a philosophical enlightenment. So what does this have to do with the healing of a blind man? Okay. All of this information about the Enlightenment points out the arrogance of man and what he thinks he has created, in contrast to the sophisticated systems that man creates that fail at enlightenment. The enlightenment that Jesus brought was personal as well as spiritual. It was personal. And so that there's something just a little bit different going on. Man creates all these systems, and God directly heals somebody and reveals himself to them directly, rather than going by route of philosophy. So Jesus didn't use philosophy. He used a simple opportunity through healing this blind man to present himself as the light. Okay. Let's go to question 546. What was the role of sin in the blind man's suffering? And this is where we get to those questions now. It's based on the same verses there. The question is, well, why is this man blind? Was his sin? Was his parents' sin? And Jesus said, no, it was for God's glory that this happened. So the answer you got was A. Okay, there we go. None. His misfortune was to be an opportunity for Christ's glory. And we need to do some thinking here. Let's look at the wrong answers to start off then. C, all suffering is the natural consequence of our transgressions, so the blind man must have sinned. Okay, well, no, obviously not, because Jesus said not. Okay, now the reason I put that in there is because although we do reap what we sow, and often suffering can be the natural consequence of our sin, there are other reasons for suffering also. Okay, I'm getting ready in my Bible reading schedule. I'm coming up on the book of Job, and I always have, I look at Job and I just wrestle with the middle section of the book. Okay, because all of Job's friends are basically saying, Job, you must have sinned. Okay, nothing happens without sinning. Okay, so, but look at B. Okay, all sickness is caused by sin, so either his parents or he had sinned. Well, even though John was able to record how this man's affliction was from his birth, the disciples, being in Jerusalem, would not have any knowledge of this man. And sometimes we are the victim of our own choices, but sometimes we are the victim of somebody else's choice. However, neither of these were the case here, okay? Sometimes I try to explain to people, okay, about sin. I'll say, okay, if somebody takes a gun and shoots, who sinned? Okay, the guy who got shot or the guy who did the shooting? Well, obviously the guy who did the shooting, okay? But we suffer sometimes because of what somebody else did. Now, there's a general judgment on the world. As Jesus indicates here, there is suffering in the world because there's a general judgment on the world. Here, God's grace is glorified in touching this man. The issue is not whether God is not fair for not healing everyone suffering equally. Okay, somebody would like to complain, well, why doesn't God heal everybody? Okay, he must want this man to suffer. That's what he did. If he didn't want if he's not for suffering, why doesn't he heal everybody? Well, if he were being fair, he actually would just judge everyone, and none of us would have any relief if he was being fair. It's kind of like this old joke where the guy says, he had the withered hand. He says, "Oh Lord, please make my hand like the other one." Got it the next day, and both hands were withered. Okay, if we went by what's fair, because the judgment that goes around would then have to be equal, because we don't deserve any of it. Okay, God's gracious in order to help us out. If you look at Romans chapter 2, verse 4, we have a special statement there. The fact that any of us have any good days is because of God's goodness and grace. Okay, they're all above and beyond. None of them should be there if what we got was fair. God let me see. You might ask, what is the purpose of God being gracious at all? And it's there in Romans 2, verse 4. Despisest thou the riches of his goodness and forbearance and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leadeth thee to repentance? The man was not singled out to be created blind from birth, so God could make a miracle. Jesus points out how his Father has allowed corrupted nature to take its course, to demonstrate all along the way through his miracles that man doesn't have to remain on his course to hell. And so it's that if you got what's fair, it would be just, well, we wouldn't be here at all if we got what was fair. We just, Adam and Eve be in hell and that would be it. Okay, that's what's fair. But nature takes its course, and God is calling people out of that. And every once in a while he does an extra freebie and does a miracle like this, all of it, to bring us forward. Now, if you stop and think about it, I think I'm going to comment on this later on. I think it comes up too. We have the miraculous going on in our lives all the time. And just the fact that we get up and breathe and we're not dropping dead of heart attacks at any moment, that's God's goodness there. I'll save other parts for another things coming up. Okay, so question 547. Why would the people have brought the healed man to the Pharisees? And this is not immediately obvious. It's something you get by implication. John chapter 9, we look at verses 13 and 14. They brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind. And it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Let me just turn the microphone off over here. Okay, so can you glean why would the people have brought the healed man to the Pharisees? Answer you got would be? Okay, it is C. It's a little bit hard, okay, to get that though. Because Jesus had healed the man on the Sabbath contrary to their interpretation of the law. Now, you don't see a direct statement about that, but if you look at A and B, because they wanted the Pharisees to see the power of Christ, or because the Pharisees were looking for proof of Christ's power? Well, they were not looking for proof of Christ's power. They weren't. They were rejecting of it all. It's not so clear exactly why they brought the man to the Pharisees, but the Pharisees were not known for looking for more proof. They weren't familiar with the power of Christ and didn't even really know who he was as you read the passage. And so, we don't know where this guy came from is essentially what they say. Well, by implication, the fact that they made sure to bring the man being healed on the Sabbath to the Pharisees, instead of throwing a party and rejoicing with him, suggests that they were looking for how the Pharisees would react to this event on the Sabbath. They didn't wait till another time. It was like, hey, it's a Sabbath. You're healed. let's get you over to the Pharisees. Well, the only interest the Pharisees would have would be that a healing had happened on the Sabbath. And so that's the problem there. And this question here is to highlight, again, the fact that the Pharisees added on interpretations. It's not, some of their interpretations were not so bad. It's the added on interpretations that they treated as authority. That was where the greatest problem was. Okay, question 548. What amazed the healed man? And this is based on John 9:24 and verses 37 to 34. John 9:24 says, "Then again called they the man that was blind, and said unto him, Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner." And then verse number 27, this is where he has the argument with them. He answered them, "I have told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples?" Then they reviled him and said, "Thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spake unto Moses. As for this fellow, we not know from whence he is." The man answered and said unto them, "Why, herein is a marvelous thing. You know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes." Verse 31, "Now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshipper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth." Now remember, they just said back in verse 24, they identified him as a sinner. Verse 32, "Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing." They answered and said unto him, "Thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us?" And they cast him out. Okay, so the answer is, what amazed the healed man? Okay, A, if Jesus was a sinner, how could he heal? Okay, he was not amazed at how logical the Pharisees were. They were the opposite of logical. He was calling them in their bad logic. Okay, also, for B, how the Pharisees knew all about Jesus? No, they didn't. They said this plainly. According to verses 29 and 30, the Pharisees revealed that they really don't know enough about Jesus, and the man called them on it. The bad logic that the Pharisees used was to build upon presuppositions that were mere baseless assumptions. And instead of ascertaining where Jesus was from, instead of determining where he was from, they merely assumed that he was not one of them. Now, we get that from the fact that they called him a sinner. They were not saying that he was an immoral man. Most of the time when we think of somebody as a sinner, we think of somebody as he's engaged in sin. He's doing bad things. He's stealing, he's carousing, he's doing all these things. That's not what they were saying, though. You see, for a Pharisee, they looked at people that were either of the Pharisee class, and the non-Pharisee class were the sinners. Okay? That would be like saying, well, we're the good church, or we're the good church, we'd be saying everybody else was bad. That's what that would be like saying. And so when they called him a sinner, all they were saying was, we don't know this guy as a Pharisee. He's not like us. He's not practicing as a Pharisee. So they made a big assumption. They assumed that he was part of the common sinner class of non-practitioners of Phariseeism. And so the fact he was that, this man calls him on it. You're saying as a sinner, how can a sinner do this kind of work? And so the man was not impressed with their logic. If he were not of God, then he could do nothing, which they themselves had argued back in verse number 16. They had argued it themselves that he couldn't do it because of not of God. The Pharisees, however, their response, they resort to an ad hominem attack. Ad hominem means against the man. Instead of actually talking about what the man says and what the arguments are, it'd be like saying, let me see, okay. Got to be careful, because if I say something against somebody here, then it won't sound good. Okay, so this guy right here, he's arguing with me. Oh yeah, well you're ugly. Okay, that would be an ad hominem attack. Okay, you don't have a big time Harvard degree, so nothing you say could be of any importance. that is an ad hominem attack. And so that's what they do to the man. Oh yeah, you were all born in your sins, and you're going to lecture us? And so but the man, he's got them dead to rights. He uses their own logic against them, and he calls them on it. Brother Tone.
I just thought that the healed man was engaging in irony. He said, oh, you're so inquisitive about him. Are you also deciding to follow him?
Yeah, I don't know if he was genuine or it was ironic. That's for sure. Okay. You know, oh, you want to follow him too? Yeah. Microphone. Wait, take the microphone.
The point he was trying to make was he was basically trying to push their buttons because they were repeatedly asking him the same questions, and so he's saying, why did you keep asking me these same questions? And yeah, so he succeeded in pushing their buttons.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be involved there. Okay, question 549. How did people respond to the healing of the blind man? It's based on John 9, verses 19 to 23. And they asked him, saying, is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then doth he now see? His parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him. He shall speak for himself. These words spake his parents because they feared the Jews. Remember the Jews? We're talking about the people of culture and of class in Jerusalem and Judea, in the Judean area there. Okay, everybody was Jewish there, but if you were called a Jew, that meant that you were following all the customs as much as you could. So they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore said his parents, he's of age, ask him. So the answer, how do the people respond to the healing of the blind man? B, they were afraid of the officials, so they were afraid to testify of him. So if you look at A and C, they became more committed to following Jesus, or they denied that a miracle had taken place. Well, there was no denying that a miracle had taken place, and we do not see here people really flocking to Jesus. Now, the response is of the man's parents. They're the ones who are saying, ask him directly. Okay, but the parents, their response is representative of the state of the mind of the people. Their response demonstrates that there was this general fear all over, or else they would have been emboldened to say, well, I got everybody behind me. No, they had everybody willing to be against them, and so they would be afraid of what would go on with that. Very much same thing's true forever. Okay, question 550. How did the healed man respond to Jesus when he met him again? It's based on verses 35 to 38. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said unto him, dost thou believe on the Son of God? He answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe on him? And Jesus said unto him, thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. And he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. So the answer is, yes, B, he believed and worshipped him. Okay, now if you look at C, he thanked him and went his way. Well, as we've noted, someone who is resistant to God, C, my glasses. Okay, C, he asked for further proof of who he was. As we've noted before on other questions, someone who's resistant to God would try to raise the bar or move the goalposts and try to seek further proof. Now, this seems like it would be an unlikely response for somebody who had such great deliverance, but this really does actually happen in the face of such blessing. There are people, they'll get the blessings of God, and they will, they'll just, instead of appreciating it, if they're resistant to God, they'll just try to slough it off and find something else more to do. I think if I had such a healing as that, I think I'd be a little bit appreciative of God. It takes somebody who's really resistant, and like I said, it actually happens. There are people that are just like that. Okay, if you look at A is similar to C. He thanked him and went on his way. Well, this is not as bad as raising the bar. This is just having a casual response. Just saying, oh, thanks, God, much obliged, walking on. Okay, that's also totally inappropriate. However, judging by people how treat church so casually, it should be obvious that this is also a very real reaction that people have. And people have the miraculous stuff that goes on in their life, and their casual dealings with God, church becomes optional. Serving God is optional. And optional turns into, in reality, they just don't. They just don't do it. Okay, so B, the obvious response is to worship Jesus. Okay, question 551, our last question. What judgment did Jesus have for the Pharisees? Based on verses 39 to 41, and Jesus said, "For judgment I am come into this world, that they which see not might see, and they which see might be made blind." And some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words, and said unto him in their best whiny voice, "Are we blind also?" Jesus said unto them, "If you were blind, you should have no sin, but now you say, we see, therefore your sin remaineth." Okay, so what judgment did Jesus have for the Pharisees? See, they were guilty because they chose not to believe in the face of his testimony. Okay, looking at B, they were given salvation based on their sincerity. Sincerity doesn't count. B points out how someone can be sincere and yet they are sincerely wrong. Sincerity does not count if it is misplaced sincerity. If you look at A, they were to be excused for their lack of knowledge. Some people will say, well, how can you hold something against somebody if they grew up in a system where they were not exposed to Christianity and they never heard of a Bible? How can they be judged? Okay. They'll think that ignorance is an excuse. Well, just because someone is brought up in a wrong belief system does not mean that they will be judged by how faithful they were to the system that they knew. In fact, if I remember correctly, if you look at the Catechism of Rome, this is exactly what they allow for, that if somebody was born a Muslim and they faithfully followed that would count for them. But of course, they give no slack to Protestants. And for them, no, they have to be part of the Holy Mother Church. But no, ignorance is not an excuse because God has sent his light into the world. In fact, everyone has light given to them from God for faith, to feed their faith. So C points out how those who have truth presented to them are extra responsible. So he's come into the world to present the light so that some who have not seen will see more and get saved. But for those who get it, it is given to them to make them more accountable so that they reject it. They are truly without excuse. In other words, they're more accountable.